At a party, my husband told new acquaintances, "This is my practice wife. I'm learning from her what not to look for in women." Everyone laughed while I stood there, blushing with shame. Turns out, he's been saying this for 6 months. I stood there in the middle of that crowded living room, holding my drink so tightly I thought the glass might shatter. The laughter echoed around me like some twisted soundtrack to my humiliation. My stomach dropped to my feet as I watched these strangers nod and chuckle at what they thought was just harmless husband humor. But I knew better. This wasn't the first time. The worst part wasn't even the joke itself. It was how natural it sounded coming out of his mouth, like he'd rehearsed it 100 times. Which, I realized with growing horror, he probably had. My face burned as I excused myself to the bathroom, mumbling something about needing to freshen up. I locked the door behind me and stared at my reflection. 27 years old, successful in my design work, and somehow I'd become the punchline to my own husband's comedy routine. How had I gotten here? When did I become someone's practice run instead of their choice? The party continued without me as I splashed cold water on my face, trying to wash away the shame. But shame has this funny way of clinging to you, doesn't it? It seeps into your skin and follows you home, sits with you at breakfast, whispers in your ear during meetings. That night, after we got home, I tried to bring it up. I started carefully, the way you approach a wounded animal. I told him how the comment made me feel, how it hurt to be reduced to a learning experience in front of strangers. He looked at me like I was being dramatic, like I was the problem for not getting the joke. He said I was too sensitive, that everyone knew he was kidding around. But there's this thing about jokes. They revealed truths we're not supposed to say out loud. And his truth was becoming clearer every day. Over the next few weeks, I started paying attention in ways I hadn't before. At the grocery store, he'd tell the cashier about his temporary wife, while I bagged our groceries. At his work events, he'd introduce me as his first draft to colleagues' actual wives. Each time, I'd smile and play along because what else do you do when you're trapped in someone else's narrative? The breaking point came 3 weeks later at his cousin's barbecue. I was helping in the kitchen when I overheard him outside on the deck, talking to a group of his relatives. His voice carried through the screen door as he explained how marriage was like buying a car. You need to test drive a few before you know what you really want. He told them I was his learning curve, that his next wife would benefit from all the mistakes he was making with me. He actually used the phrase "practice makes perfect" while describing our marriage. His aunt laughed and said something about young people these days, and his uncle clapped him on the back like he was some kind of genius for figuring out the system. I set down the potato salad I'd been carrying and walked straight out the back gate. I didn't say goodbye, didn't make excuses. I just left. He found me sitting in the car 20 minutes later, keys in my hand, but nowhere to go. The drive home was silent except for the sound of my own breathing. He seemed confused by my reaction, like he genuinely couldn't understand why I was upset. That's when I realized something that chilled me to the bone. He really didn't see anything wrong with what he was doing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the little comments I'd dismissed over the past months. How he'd tell people we were figuring things out instead of building something together. How he'd joke about being tied down like marriage was some kind of prison sentence he was serving. I started remembering our wedding day differently. Had he meant those vows, or were they just part of the experiment? Was I walking down the aisle toward a husband, or toward someone who saw me as a rough draft of his real life? The next morning, I made coffee for one. When he asked where his cup was, I told him practice wives don't serve coffee. He laughed, thinking I was finally getting into the spirit of his joke. But I wasn't joking anymore. Update 1. It's been 2 weeks since I stopped playing along with his practice wife routine, and things have gotten weird in ways I didn't expect. First, he seemed almost relieved that I was pushing back. Not because he realized he was hurting me, but because he thought it proved his point about me being difficult. He started telling people I was showing my true colors and that this was exactly the kind of behavior he was learning to avoid in future relationships. The validation he got from others was like fuel to a fire. His friends would nod knowingly when he complained about my attitude change, like they were all part of some secret club of men who'd figured out the marriage game. They'd pat him on the back and tell him he was smart to keep his options open. But something unexpected happened. I started talking to other people too. I reached out to my college roommate, someone I'd drifted away from since getting married. When I told her what had been happening, the silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. Then she said something that knocked the wind out of me. I was wondering when you'd call. We've all been worried about you. Apparently, his practice wife routine wasn't news to anyone in our social circle. People had been talking about it for months, but nobody knew what to say to me. Some thought it was just his crude sense of humor. Others were genuinely concerned, but didn't want to interfere in our marriage. My sister, who I finally worked up the courage to tell, was furious. She reminded me of things I'd forgotten, how he used to introduce me as his girlfriend to some people and his friend to others, depending on the situation. How he'd always kept one foot out the door, even during our engagement. The more I talked to people who actually cared about me, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't new behavior. It was just the latest version of how he'd always treated our relationship, like it was temporary, like I was temporary. But here's where it gets complicated. I started going out more without him, spending time with friends I'd neglected, rediscovering parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. And for the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Not someone's practice round, not a rough draft, just me. He noticed the change immediately. Suddenly, the man who'd been publicly shopping for Wife 2.0 was asking why I was never home, why I seemed different, why I wasn't as invested in working on us anymore. The irony wasn't lost on me. The practice wife was finally practicing being herself again. Last weekend, we were invited to another party. Same crowd, same social dynamic where he usually performed his routine. But this time, when someone asked how married life was treating us, I spoke first. I told them it was educational, that I was learning so much about what I actually wanted in a partner, what I deserved in a relationship, and what red flags looked like when you finally stopped making excuses for them. The room went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of shared understanding, but the awkward quiet of people realizing they'd been watching something uncomfortable all along. He tried to laugh it off, tried to steer the conversation back to his usual script, but something had shifted. I wasn't playing my assigned role anymore, and without my participation, his whole act fell flat. That night, he accused me of trying to embarrass him, of not supporting him, of changing the rules in the middle of the game. And maybe he was right about that last part. Maybe I was changing the rules. Maybe that's exactly what needed to happen. Update 2. 3 weeks ago, I did something I never thought I'd have the courage to do. I started looking at apartments. Not because I'd made up my mind about anything, but because I needed to know I had options. For too long, I'd felt trapped in his narrative about our marriage, like I was just a character in his story with no agency of my own. Looking at those rental listings felt like reclaiming something fundamental about myself. The first apartment I looked at was tiny, barely bigger than our walk-in closet. But standing in that empty living room, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: possibility. The landlord asked if my husband would be joining me to see the place, and I realized I'd been holding my breath, waiting for someone to question my right to make decisions about my own life. I told him I was looking for myself, just myself. The words felt foreign coming out of my mouth, but also strangely liberating. Meanwhile, things at home were reaching a breaking point. He'd started bringing up the practice wife thing even more frequently, like he was doubling down on his position. But now there was an edge to it, an anger that hadn't been there before. He told his coworkers I was having some kind of breakdown, that the stress of being married was making me unstable. The gaslighting was subtle but constant. He'd bring up conversations that never happened, insist I'd agreed to things I'd never agreed to, question my memory of events we'd both witnessed. It was like living with someone who was slowly erasing my version of reality and replacing it with his own. But the strangest thing happened. The more he tried to convince everyone that I was the problem, the more people started seeing through his act. His own mother called me. She'd heard about his practice wife comments from other family members, and she was mortified. She apologized for raising someone who would treat his wife that way, and she asked me point blank if I was okay. When I started crying on the phone with her, she said something that changed everything. "You know you deserve better than this, right? You know this isn't normal." That conversation haunted me for days. Because somewhere along the way, I'd stopped knowing what normal looked like. I'd adjusted my expectations so gradually, made so many excuses for his behavior, that I'd lost track of what a healthy relationship was supposed to feel like. I started writing things down. Not for anyone else to see, just for me. I wrote about how it felt to be introduced as someone's practice run. How it felt to watch strangers laugh at jokes about my inadequacy. How it felt to go to bed next to someone who saw our marriage as a learning experience rather than a commitment. The writing helped me see patterns I'd been too close to recognize. How he'd always positioned himself as the expert in our relationship, the one who knew what we needed, what I needed, what was best for both of us. How my opinions had gradually become suggestions, then requests, then whispers I kept to myself. 2 weeks ago, he came home with news that changed everything. He'd been offered a position in another state, a good opportunity that would require us to relocate within the month. He was excited, already making plans, talking about how the move would be good for us, how it would give us a fresh start. But he wasn't really talking to me. He was talking at me, the way you talk to someone whose agreement you assume rather than seek. He'd already told his new employer he'd take the job. He'd already started researching neighborhoods. He'd made a decision about our life without consulting me, because in his mind, I was just along for the ride anyway. That night, I sat in my car in the parking lot of the second apartment I'd looked at. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine if I wanted it. I called the landlord and put down a deposit. For the first time in months, I felt like I was making a choice instead of just reacting to choices someone else had made for me. Final update. I moved out last Tuesday. The apartment I chose isn't much, a one-bedroom with old hardwood floors and windows that stick when you try to open them. But it's mine. Every piece of furniture, every dish in the cabinet, every decision about how to arrange the space, it's all mine. The morning I left, he seemed genuinely shocked. Like he'd been so caught up in his own narrative about our practice marriage that he'd forgotten I was a real person who could make real decisions. He kept asking what had changed, what he'd done wrong, why I was throwing away everything we'd built together. But that was the thing, we hadn't built anything together. He'd been building his case study, his learning experience, his cautionary tale about what not to look for in a wife. I'd just been living in it. The hardest part wasn't packing my clothes or dividing up the kitchen supplies. It was walking away from the version of myself I'd become in that house, the woman who smiled through humiliation, who made excuses for cruelty, who had somehow convinced herself that being someone's practice wife was better than being alone. He tried different tactics as the reality set in. First, anger. How could I be so selfish, so dramatic, so unwilling to work on our problems? Then bargaining. He'd stop making those jokes, he'd be more considerate, he'd change. Finally, a weird kind of vindication. See, this just proved his point about me being unstable, about him needing someone more committed, about our marriage being a learning experience. Even in the end, I was still just material for his story about himself. But here's what he didn't expect. I started telling my own story. I talked to friends, family, anyone who would listen. Not to trash him or get revenge, but to reclaim my own narrative. To say out loud that I wasn't a practice wife, wasn't a rough draft, wasn't anyone's learning curve. I was a person who deserved to be chosen, not endured. The response surprised me. Other women started sharing their own stories about partners who treated them like temporary solutions, like placeholders for the real relationship they were planning to have someday. About the slow erosion of self-worth that happens when someone treats your love like a trial run. My college roommate told me she'd stayed in a relationship for 3 years with someone who introduced her as his maybe girlfriend, depending on his mood. My coworker admitted her ex-husband used to tell people she was his starter wife until he could afford someone better. We'd all been carrying these stories alone, ashamed of how we'd let ourselves be treated. 3 weeks into living alone, I was having coffee in my tiny kitchen when I realized something had shifted. The constant background noise of anxiety that had been with me for months was gone. I wasn't walking on eggshells, wasn't monitoring my words, wasn't bracing myself for the next humiliation disguised as humor. I was just sitting in my own space, drinking coffee I'd made for myself, planning a day that belonged entirely to me. He texted me last week. He'd moved to his new job in another state, and he wanted me to know he was doing well, meeting new people, learning from our experience together. He thanked me for helping him figure out what he really wanted in a partner. I read the message twice, waiting for the familiar sting of being reduced to a learning experience. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt something like gratitude, not for him, but for the journey that led me here. I deleted the message without responding. Yesterday, I signed up for a pottery class. I don't know if I'll be any good at it, and I don't care. I'm not practicing for anything anymore. I'm not preparing to be someone's wife, someone's girlfriend, someone's anything except exactly who I am right now. The instructor asked us to introduce ourselves and share what brought us to the class. When my turn came, I said my name clearly, looked around the room at these strangers who might become friends, and told them I was there because I wanted to create something beautiful with my own hands. Nobody laughed. Nobody questioned my motivations or analyzed my choices. They just nodded and welcomed me to the group. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged, not as someone's practice run, but as the main character in my own story. The clay felt cool and forgiving in my hands as I began to shape it into something new.